change is inevitable. We have to move forward. People have to adapt. Industries need to look at what they can change, look at the science, and start to embrace it a little bit more. I mean, in my opinion, welfare science is an enabler. It is what will allow the social license to be maintained, and it will enable us to continue to enjoy riding our horses and people making a living out of them.
So welcome to another episode of Changing Rein. We are so happy today to have Professor Nat or Natalie Waran join us, OBE. Nat really probably doesn't need much of an introduction to anyone who is interested in horses and in particular horse welfare. But you know, she has been the chair of the FEI Commission. She's contributed to many, many policies and advances in horse welfare in particular around the world. And I've probably made a bit of a hash of that, Nat, but we will put your full bio up so people can read exactly all of the things that you've done in our show notes. So welcome to Changing Rein, Nat. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen and Mita, for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted. I'm very excited about this.
Excellent. So, Nat, I remember when I first sort of started to dive into thinking about horse welfare, I came across your book, The Welfare of Horses, which was published in 2007. And it really is a landmark text. And I commend it to anyone who is interested in getting a bit of a head start on animal welfare. So I'm really curious, what led you to publishing that book? What do you think was the most important topic you covered in that book? And what's the most significant thing that's changed since you published it?
Well, to be honest, Karen, that I edited that book, and I'd been asked to do so by a professor who was based in Australia but was from the UK originally, who had been commissioned, I think, by Clua to develop a whole series of welfare books about different species. And mine was first off the block with horses. I don't know why horses were the first ones, but I was asked if I would do it. And I hadn't a clue really about editing books. I realise I'm quite a big picture person, so I find the detail of the edit often quite it's more difficult for me. But anyway, I embarked on that, and I used the fact that I was on maternity leave with my second child, I think. And of course, you know, I was sort of feeding the baby. I was stuck at home for, I think I was only there about 3 months, but I'd got going on doing this book, and I managed to finish a lot of the editing and bringing together all of these amazing authors during that period. And so, in fact, the first edition of the book, I think, ended up being published at the beginning of 2002. And then I think there was a second edition that we just sort of revised a few things and put it back out again. So it was a long time ago. And it coincided with, you know, a very significant time of my life when I think my view on things had changed quite a bit, just because I was now mum. And so I couldn't be completely spending all my time out there looking after my horses and trying to give them the best life. But it did kind of make me, you know, I think keen to be able to share, and it sounds a bit trite, really, but to share knowledge. I think that's what comes with, you know, that kind of period of your life. And I was already lecturing at Edinburgh University at the vet school and running master's programs, but I felt like this was a chance to focus on the thing I was most passionate about at a time that I probably had some space to be able to do that. So we pulled together a lot of different pieces of information in that book, and my objective was to show the kind of evolution of the horse right the way through the various things that we involved horses with, and even the working equids, and some of the challenges that they all face in their different contexts. And then perhaps just to put sort of forward some ideas about how we might use what we knew then from science to actually improve their lot, and drive things forward. So saying that it was a long time ago means that things have changed quite a bit. And I'd be, I mean, that the book, in fact, Clive did ask me if I would go back and do a third edition, but I'd sort of felt like perhaps somebody else could step in at that point. But I think, there's a lot that has changed just because we have a lot of knowledge now. At that time, the science that involved things like equitation science and so on hadn't even really been thought of. So things have changed quite a bit. We know more, but I'd still say that there's still quite a lot that we know that we don't use that hasn't actually led to the kind of change that one would hope it should.
Yeah, we'll definitely touch on that more. But I want to now fast forward to 2022, and the FEI announced that they have come up with this Ethics and Wellbeing Commission, of which you were the chair. Can you tell us what's the hardest bit about chairing a committee like that?
I think that anyone who sort of puts themselves out there to try to bring about some positive change will know that they're not always popular, I suppose. So I think the chairing of the actual commission, the actual, the operational side of it, which was bringing together a group of people, most of whom didn't know each other, some people who were working within the FEI or within the sports, others that were scientists or ethicists. That kind of bringing together operationally is always challenging because you're trying to make sure that people have a voice, that that you are respectful of everybody's different opinions. But at the end of the day, as a chair, you have to bring it all together and deliver reports on deadlines and keep driving the thing forward. So all of that operationally was challenging just because it requires work and a focus. But the bit I suppose that was the most challenging for me was being the voice. At the end of the day, I was seen as the messenger. And whilst I think there was an awful lot of people who were very positive about the commission and the work of the commission, and then some of the recommendations, obviously, that came out of that, um, I think there were others who just found it quite challenging, realised that we were challenging the way in which they had always lived their lives, the way that they dealt with their horses. And it did bring about some resistance initially, which was difficult.
You mentioned earlier, Nat, that you were a big picture person. Do you think that helped with the overall shape of what came out of that commission? That you were able to maybe step back and see things, because each, as you say, your committee members came with their different perspectives, and maybe being a big picture person is useful in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, possibly that is why I find it great work to do, and that I can lift myself a little bit from the detail. Because I think if you do get too caught up in the specifics and the detail, you lose sight of what it was you were trying to achieve. I was very clear and kept reinforcing that every time I was in front of the FEI's general assemblies or the different sports forums, that we had been given a task to do, that the FEI had wanted us to behave independently, given us an independent website and an independent platform, but they had wanted something from us, which was that they weren't quite sure, I think, quite what was going to come out of it all, but and I'm sure that they didn't think it was going to be quite as big as we made it. But they charged us with telling them what they should be doing to address social license issues. And I think what we gave them at the end of the 1.5 year period, 2 year period, was a very big piece of work. I think that was not too detailed. Of course, it went into the detail of why. It gave information that was evidence that we'd been able to collect, but it gave recommendations, but they were quite broad. They weren't specific, although some people might think they were very specific. From my point of view, it was a big sort of piece of work that could enable the FEI to then take that forward with their own planning.
So you mentioned before about getting some resistance to some of the work that you did on that commission. And I remember at one point there was a recommendation, I think, maybe it was only a draft, about making double bridles optional in dressage. And that got quite a big sort of response from the industry. Were you expecting that response to that recommendation? And why do you think it was such a big response?
Yes, I did expect that. It didn't surprise
Yeah.
me because we were challenging the norm. I mean, it's not the first time that point had been made about double bridles and other equipment that is mandatory. When we met as a commission, we were looking for early recommendations that we could make that we felt could be, discussed and potentially regulated. And we were encouraged really to think like that, that we were there to make positive recommendations, make positive change, or help make positive change if we could. And so there were 6 early recommendations that we made following our first meeting before the first General Assembly that we went to. And some of those were taken up because they were sorts of things that the FEI were able to implement, relatively well and easily. But the double bridle, spurs, and tight nosebands early recommendations were ones that did get quite a bit of play and discussion. And the double bridle one, as you know, got played out fairly publicly. And there was, there was a lot of support, but there was also people who felt that we were interfering with the sport, that we weren't focused around welfare, that they felt this was a sport issue, not a welfare issue. And yet we had, in my mind anyway, given a fair bit of evidence for why we believed that compulsory use of the double bridle at certain levels was, from our point of view, a welfare risk.
Yeah, like recently I was asked to provide some support for a member-led submission to an organisation here in Australia about introducing the option of allowing bit-free in dressage for this particular organisation. I wonder, is this a bit of a case of amateurs being ahead of the professionals in our sport? What do you think about that?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, I think people want choice and they want to make choices that are the best choices for them and their horses. And there are some horses, even at the highest level, and these are people who spoke to us about this, who don't go well in a double bridle. And it's a horrible thing for them to, feel that they perhaps don't get the best out of their horse in that particular piece of equipment. The same goes for, other riders who have horses that really don't accept or don't, they really are quite confronted by a bit in their mouths. And those riders want to ride their horses and do the best for their horses, and they want to be able to have to make choices for their horse. So I think, I don't think it's an amateur professional thing. I mean, I think in some cases some comment from the professionals, not all, but some professionals, has been that riding with the double bridle, if you are a very experienced professional rider, is not a welfare risk because you know what you're doing and you're able to ride very lightly. Um, and I'd say an amateur rider might well exactly say the same thing. If you can ride without a bit in the horse's mouth and still, have the same lovely performance and the horse is comfortable, that in fact you should be able to do that. I don't think it's a professional versus amateur thing. I think it's just a different point of view around what the sport is, and those people who believe that dressage is a particular thing that has to be done in a specific way, I think struggle with this idea of having no bits or having no compulsory double bridle. I do think it's changing though, Karen. I mean,
Yeah.
you see it now. People are, because the conversation started, what was normal now is starting to shift, and more people are having a voice, and there's a whole bunch of influencers who are demonstrating that they can do things without spurs, they can do things without double bridles, and they're comfortable doing that. And so I can see there's quite a shift now.
Mm. I think
Yeah.
sometimes we forget dressage or any of these sports, they're a human construct. We have built this edifice of what dressage looks like, but we can also have built or could have built another edifice where it looked very, very different.
I also think that it's being realistic about what people want to do now. It's interesting. I was just reading an article that one of our trainers, dressage riders in New Zealand, who's a more senior gentleman who, has been very influential here in New Zealand, and him kind of observing that what we're seeing now is fewer people being able to afford to, ride at kind of, at competition level. A lot of people feeling that because there's more horses that are the kind of more elevated, superior, that these horses that are coming into the country that are being ridden by people often, you know, will get better marks. And therefore, if you're an average, ordinary horse with a rider that wants to ride occasionally, that, you don't stand a chance if you do compete. So what's the point? Just go and do amateur stuff. And and then there's the whole question of there are other things that people do that are more enjoyable to them and are more open and accessible, like working equitation, which has become extremely popular over here. So he's pointing out, as someone who's very involved with the sport, that the sport needs to think about these things and make itself more accessible. And I mean, obviously the financial side of it's a problem too, and just recognize that not everybody is on a horse that can perform amazing graces above the ground, but that they are demonstrating that they're able to school that horse well, and have a harmonious relationship that you can judge.
If we could just go back to the FEI Commission for a second, Nat, I was very impressed by the report and what came out of it, and I can see from what you're saying that you couldn't get into the minutiae of how these recommendations should actually play out in practice. So we've had the response from the FEI, we've a vision statement, we have a permanent ethics and wellbeing advisory committee, we have an internal wellbeing. But when you go onto the FEI website, there's not as much there as I would have hoped to see. What are we, a year on? And I'm just wondering how you feel about, and maybe that's the way of these things, change happens slowly, but I'm just interested in your perspective at this stage.
I think, as I was commenting before we actually came on air, every single project that I have been lucky enough to be involved with, I have learned so much. So I go in often with some ideas or with some knowledge that I think I have, and then immediately, realize that actually I don't know anything at all. And I think that's what happened with the FEI. I mean, I had been fairly vocal, actually, about the FEI not getting on with it. This was before I even got involved with them, that they, come on, they should show some leadership. And, they talk about happy athletes. What do they mean? They should start measuring things, all of those things. But as I got to know the FEI's structure a bit more, I realized that this was a large beast of a thing. Basically a governance body that makes regulations that relates to and that requires the support and discussion of many, many national federations, some of them, very large, and some of them much smaller, but all of them having one vote at the end of the day when it gets to the General Assembly. So I think once I realized that, speed was not something that was going to happen with a large, unwieldy organization, that they do have mechanisms. They've got their technical committees, that they've got the ability to make, changes where it's absolutely important that they happen straight away. But generally speaking, change is made by sort of discussion, and hopefully sort of they vote on changes, but they try to reach some form of kind of consensus, and so that the sports can move on together. Now, we may or may not agree with all of that, but that is the reality. So when I handed over this very large report at the last General Assembly, I was told that they would start to, come up with their own action plan, and their own action plan was unveiled, only about 4 or 5 months later. So that was fairly speedily. But the action plan has a whole range of complexity to it. And so, yes, I think the reality is that it will be slow in some parts, fast in others. And to be honest, I think what I have talked about quite a bit since then has been that change will happen much faster at local level and at national level, with national federations that just want to get on with things. And if you look at what some of the countries in Europe are doing, Australia, New Zealand, they're in a position where they can just move much swifter, and they're getting on with things.
I have been in that situation of being in a racing regulatory role, and I can see from that, and I get frustrated sometimes because people say, oh, the FEI should be doing this, oh, Horse Racing Ireland should be doing that. But the reality is, as you say, things happen slowly, and that's for a reason, because you do want to bring people with you as much as possible.
You do, but I mean, one of the things that we emphasised quite a bit with our report, and in all of the meetings that we had, was the importance of the elite showing strong leadership. And one of the things that's very noticeable is that welfare is the buzzword. So everybody's prioritising welfare or putting the horse first, or some such mix of those words. And in reality, you've got to start testing those things, otherwise you just get into that whole welfare washing space where you say it, but you're not actually showing it or doing it. And at the moment, I would say that there's a fair bit of publicity about things changing, or, independent groups being formed, these sorts of things. And those equestrians who have in the past been shown that they were concerned about welfare standards for competition horses, I think, at least feel like something's happening. But that can't just be something for a long time. They will start to lose faith if there's not something very obvious that is changed. And that, fiddling around the edges is fine, but there are some dramatic changes that probably do need to take place. And I suspect that those ones will be much slower and harder to bring about.
We've seen that around the world. Another animal use sport in greyhound racing, like in a few jurisdictions, that's been phased out. And I know here in Australia, we had the head vet of New South Wales greyhound racing, I think, quit because he was frustrated at how slow the industry was to change and improve things for dogs. Do you think there's a danger? Like, we understand that it's a big beast and change it takes time, but do you think there's a danger if the industry just moves too slowly and in addressing, like you mentioned, about actually demonstrating change to people? Do you think there's a risk there if it is too slow?
Yeah, I mean, I think the time has shown that being proactive and getting on with things is obviously the best approach to maintain social license. And that kind of reactivity that has happened too late, too little, too late, is often leads to a kind of just a downhill. And the problem with that is it's very difficult to reverse. The reality is that once you're almost losing or lost your social license, you're not going to get it back again. I don't think there's many examples of when it has actually been reversed. And I think with the dog story, what's interesting to me is that the UK, the greyhound industry there, actually did an awful lot of work. They have done an awful lot of work, good work. And I've seen their welfare strategies. I've seen the amount of money that they've put into thinking about how they can do things differently, the research, the kennel designs. They've done a huge amount under some fantastic leadership from Madeleine Campbell. And the reality is that even still, despite all of that science, all of that work, all of that commitment, the public still don't have a lot of faith. So, I think it is important to move swiftly, be proactive, and make sure that your welfare strategy is underpinned by a really good operational plan with some good action in it that happens, in a way that the public and the other stakeholders that are interested in that particular context can feel confident that something is happening.
But by contrast, I was speaking to a senior person within racing here in Ireland recently, and basically the message was that if us lot would just shut up talking about social license, it would all go away.
Yes. Of course it will. Of course it will.
As in, social license would go away, but the reality is the opposite. How do we get that message across to people involved that this is something that is really, really crucial to the survival of equestrian sport?
I think there's been a fair bit of talk about it. Certainly the racing industry knows. Even though you might have a few that don't, but I think, mostly people now understand that even though they think they're doing the right thing for their horses, that's the problem, is that people genuinely believe that their horses are very well looked after. They're very expensive horses. They have the best of this and the best of that, the best of food. It's very difficult then to take on board that perhaps the perception of the horse's welfare or quality of life is not always a good one. And, you get this kind of resistance to that because people are uncomfortable with it. You get this cognitive dissonance where people want to distance themselves from the bad messages. And it is because they genuinely believe that they love their horses and are doing the right thing for them. And for the most part, that is the case. There are things that could change. There are areas where we know more now and we could do things differently that challenge what I call the sacred cows. The things that different sporting disciplines hold very dear. And it's not just horse sports, it's all life, really. You just have to know that change is inevitable. We have to move forward. People have to adapt. Industries need to look at what they can change, look at the science and start to embrace it a little bit more. I mean, in my opinion, welfare science is an enabler. It is what will allow the social license to be maintained, and it will enable us to continue to enjoy riding our horses and people making a living out of them.
Yeah, I have to agree, Nat. To me, when I think of welfare, I think of something positive that really it's like the golden ticket in not only to maintaining our sport, but also actually enjoying our sport. Like the better time the horse is having, really, and that was part of what I looked into in my research, was that relationship between how happy the horse is and how happy the rider is. And funnily enough, they do seem to track along together. But I wonder, I was recently talking to someone on an executive committee of an organisation, and she was saying that whenever that topic of social license is brought up, it's almost instantly shut down because there was so much fear around what that topic meant. Do you have any advice for people who are on committees about how to get that conversation going and perhaps to address some of that fear?
Yes, I suppose, because I think part of the fear is often not really understanding what it all means. And I think you're right, Mita, that people are a bit sick of hearing social license. And in fact, I've stopped using the term social license. I just say public acceptability, what's acceptable or not to those people who do not understand what it is that you do. They don't care about it particularly. They don't want to do it themselves, but they do have an opinion. And, and I think their opinion, because of what we know, social media, the way things can get whizzed about really quickly, anything negative, people will have an opinion about, often without having actually read the entirety of the message that's been sent to them. They will still have an opinion based on the first line. So we know that public acceptability is important in maintaining the sport and our ability to even ride horses. That's been questioned. And so I suppose the way that I tackle it now is I talk about what it is, to try and just be clear about what it is and what it is not and what it means. And then I would suggest that if you can provide good evidence from that particular, it's got to be from that context. So for the FEI, we went out and we looked at public opinion, but we also wanted to look at inside the house. That idea of what do the people who are actually in the house really feel about horse sports. And what was really interesting was that around about the same proportion of the equestrian people who had given us feedback felt that horse welfare probably wasn't as good as it should be. So, people who knew about horses were concerned, not just those people who you can dismiss as not knowing anything at all, if you wanted to. Not that I would dismiss their opinion, but, fair enough, their opinion's not grounded on knowing about horses. Then you ended up with this kind of cognitive dissonance going on there, which was, wow, well, they're just amateur riders. They don't know anything. We're the elite people. And that's when it gets ridiculous. The other thing that we also saw a bit of, which was, you should look at the show jumpers, or you should look at the carriage drivers, or you should look at racing, or
Racing.
and as Mita knows, I mean, my drive now has been to say we speak with one voice. We all want to, be around horses. We want horse sports generally to continue. We all want to do the right thing by the horse. And if you speak with one voice, you stop picking off each other and trying to weaken the argument, in my opinion.
Yeah, going back to the power of social media and the power of influencers, and then this thing about trying to get the science, which we all know there's some really, really good science out there, getting that more widely disseminated. What worries me is how, as you say, people read the first line of something and they understand, or they believe they understand what's being said, and how quickly something can be said that actually has no basis in science and becomes current, or becomes the currency. How do we dissect out the good from the bad and make sure that what is being promoted is proper, robust, but still understandable by people who are leading busy lives, have a lot going on? They want the sound bites, they want the key take home messages. How do we make sure that what they're hearing is what they should be hearing?
It's very interesting the way that welfare science has evolved in itself over the many years that I've been involved in the field. Because when I first started, and that was more than 30 odd years ago, we were very purist. We were, I think because it was such a young area, we were very keen to make sure that we weren't polluted by other sciences or anything else. We were welfare science, and welfare science was about measuring things, and we measured things objectively, and we used, the scientific method, and behaviour, even though people thought that was a bit soft, behaviour was very structured, and we were able to sort of put it all back to, Tim Bergen's 4 why questions and all the rest of it. But we've changed. We've actually become a lot more mature in the discipline and realised that actually welfare science is not just about the science, it's about how you change people. So you cannot, at the end of the day, animal welfare, animals know they've got a welfare, that's about the animal, but the welfare part of it is really about what we can do about it. So we know that animal welfare involves the measurement stuff, but it also involves ethical perspectives. We know it involves, a whole bunch of human behaviour change initiatives, and so on and so forth. So I think the latest kid on the block, in my opinion, is marketing and communication. So I think that, in fact, I was quite excited by a piece of work that I've been doing. I can't talk about it at the moment, but it's with another organisation, and they've sort of embraced that and realised that there's no point having animal welfare leaders or any animal welfare programmes unless people understand how to communicate their science. And so what I've seen that seems to work best at the moment, although I'm not a I'm not a marketing person, but what I have seen is where there's been infographics being developed. So, we know that people have to publish their research, peer reviewed and all the rest of it, but alongside that is a simple infographic. And so if you were then going to disseminate information from that particular research paper, you can just take the infographic. And I love it. I mean, I just grab the infographic, and that's what I now put on my presentations, because the rest of it is gobbledygook to most people. But that sort of picture of the horse doing something and there's being an outcome seems to resonate an awful lot more and gets picked up. So instead of words, pictures, instead of just lots of, highlight things, perhaps interviews, podcasts, getting scientists to learn how to speak about their science and the importance of what they do to a whole range of different audiences.
So now I want to get to the positives. We want to talk about some positives, but I want to talk at least one question about some barriers. So some people have spoken about the fact that, the horse industry has a big reliance on the big end of town, and there are some big egos and sort of wealthy and influential players in the horse industry, and this being one of the greatest barriers to change. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think there are. I mean, it's a fact, isn't it, that there are some very wealthy people, there are some very well-established people, and there are very loud voices, and they do have loud voices. And I think it is very difficult for people who perhaps have a different point of view to have their own voice in that situation. Because they might not get in the club, they might not get selected for something, they might not get funded for something, because they don't conform. But to be honest, the horse industry is no different from any other industry or club mentality, is it? So, you have to kind of say, well, I mean, this might be very politically incorrect, but from a very early stage, I realized that I worked in a vet school. As a non-vet, they used to call me a non-vet. They never called me a scientist; they just called me a non-vet. And and I was doing welfare work, which was considered to be relatively fluffy compared with the other very important clinical pieces of work. And then you got a lot of resistance about what welfare was and what we had to say and why we said this was better for animals and that the animals were choosing certain things. And in my mind, even then, I would think these people over here are people who I feel want to come along on the story. They're a bit resistant, but they're willing to change, or they're willing to absorb, or you can see stuff happening. But there's a whole bunch of other people who were a little bit older, a little bit more challenged by what we were doing. And in my mind, I just used to see them as dinosaurs. And we know what happens to dinosaurs, or what happened to the dinosaurs. So I feel that you have to look at your audience, if you like, as a whole array of different types of people. And if you looked at it as a sort of bell curve, you're going to have the extreme resistors, you're going to have the absolute keen adopters, and in the middle, you're going to have a whole bunch of other people. And I would suggest that you focus your attention at the end that you can see is going to keep moving forward. And the other end, you obviously still try and put your information out there. Some of them will adopt it and some of them just won't. And they might be the ones with the loudest voices, but by far they're going to become the minority very soon. And you're going to have a much louder voice from the other end of the bell curve. That's maybe me just thinking in a very positive way, but, I do think that you wouldn't do this work. You wouldn't have stuck at it. There's an awful lot of people, as you know. I mean, you're them too. There's a lot of people out there who have done amazing things, and they just have a very strong belief that what they do is the right thing for animals. They try to stick to their methodology. They, don't go left or right. Don't fall out with people. Just keep going with the story, because at the end of the day, we are dealing with facts.
I think what you've said too is very important for the well-being of people in this field, because I think if you were to focus on the naysayers and the dinosaurs, you could get very discouraged very quickly and your good work would be wasted. So I think it is important to keep, chipping away and working with the people that you are going to get some little bit of positivity from to help move everything forward.
Oh, I mean, I just think it's the right time for some people. This year is my racing year. So, before that it was my FEI year. But this year, suddenly racing wants to really move forward. I mean, they were doing some stuff anyway, that was fine, but it seems to me that there are quite a number of different racing groups that just say, look, we're just going to get on with this now.
Yeah.
They've seen what's happened with greyhounds, but even before that, I think they want to find a way to have their sport, but also ensure that they're using the science, moving forward, challenging themselves a little bit. And that's not all of them, but there's enough of them now that it's given me quite a lot of heart, actually, because I'm not the one that's going to them. They're coming to talk to me and others, I know are involved, and I think that's very positive, which is good.
Mm.
But it is a
Well,
timing thing. Sometimes you're knocking at doors and, and the door won't open. And then another time the door opens a wee crack and you have to be prepared. There's no point having it open and you're not ready. So you need to be able to be very positive and get through the door. And sometimes it gets slammed back in your face because they're not ready really. They don't want to hear. And then other times it suddenly gets opened and there you go. You're in to talk about what you do. And then your job is to do it well. And I mean, I've had lots of fantastic students coming through our Edinburgh programs. And my main key message to them has always been that just remember you're a scientist. That's what you're being trained to do. So, yes, there's emotion involved in this. Yes, you can get, you can feel like you're personally being questioned, but actually you're not. You've got a whole bunch of other scientists behind you. You're a researcher. You're just putting forward your interpretation of the data that you've got, and then it will move forward as other people absorb what you've done and hopefully refine it and make it better.
So flipping over to some positive things, Nat, Misha and we've talked about some like quick wins that we can see for the industry, like things that to us seem pretty obvious. Things like, banning the whip or allowing bit free. Like these are not new things. These are things that have been talked about for a long time and even exist in either some places or in some sports. So we talked a bit about, the risk of welfare washing and lots of talk, but not a lot of change. Can you see some things that the industry could do that would be like a quick win that would really show that commitment?
So I would say that it depends on who you want the quick win for. So for me, the whip. So let's just talk about whips. And there's been a very good paper that's just been written by World Horse Welfare team, or sponsored by World Horse Welfare, looking at the role of the whip. And I think that's a really important piece of work to have a read of if you haven't already. But I think that from the public's perception, particularly with racing, the whip is a problem. And I think the racing world know that. And it's also very different depending on what country you're in, how many whip strikes you can do, at what point, when, however. I don't know how the jockeys work it out, to be honest. There's some quick wins from a public point of view, because I think it's extremely difficult to explain that actually, the horses are enjoying themselves when you see the whip going as they're coming towards the finish line. And it has become so normalized, that people stop seeing it for what it is. But I think mostly the racing industry know that. It's just how they get to the next point that they've got to work through. But I think from the horse's perspective, I think there's bigger quick wins that you could have. And I think if you look again at horses that are being competed quite intensively, the way that they're housed, very traditional, mostly, not saying all, but mostly very traditional housing. For some reason, I remember learning about it with my BHS manual. You have a 12 by 12 foot stable, which I can't remember what that is in meters, but I'm sure someone will know. And in the States, it's a little bit smaller and it's called a stall. And generally speaking, walls between the horses from a biosecurity point of view, or just because that's how the stables were built. And horses' heads popping over the door if they've got an outdoor view, and sometimes they don't have an outdoor view because they're in a barn. And if they are in a barn, well, they're next to other horses, but they'll often have a big grill on the front to stop them from showing any weaving or other behaviours that are unwanted. So these, to me, are things that are fixable. These are things that have a massive impact on a lot of horses around the world all of the time, who live for 22, 23 hours in a very confined space, completely obviously against their normal evolutionary behaviour, what they've been adapted to do, and so on. And then on top of that, the social contact. People seem to think that having visual contact is enough, and actually we know that physical contact is very important for horses. So looking at the context that they live in within the sports industry, but providing them with more enriched environments, more physical contact options, and a chance to get out into a turnout space, whether that's outside or in a barn, where they can move more freely without somebody on their backs. So, I think from the horse's perspective, the quick wins are I'm sure they don't want the stick either, but, I think that the thing that probably has the biggest impact on them is the way that they live. And even something that, again, is very common. I mean, I have horses myself, so, I don't keep them in stables, but I do have them, I do put them in a transporter, put them in my truck, and off we go for a ride somewhere. So I think all of those things that you see some horses objecting to, and then that seems to be abnormal that they object, whereas actually it's pretty amazing that they tolerate these things. But then when we expect them to be living almost in a truck, charging around Europe, to a competition every weekend, and then into temporary stables and then back in the transporter, that again is something that has become normalized, but I think we just always need to be thinking about the impact that that has on the horse. That's quite a long way of saying, yes, there are quick wins, but depends on who you want the quick win for.
Yeah, no, I like your differentiation between the public and the horse. I think that's a really important point. Yeah, and just the way you described the horses traveling around in to competitions and more or less living in a truck, instantly what came into my mind was circus animals and being constantly transported from place to place. And it's just interesting because I'm sure most people wouldn't necessarily like that comparison between our horses and circus animals, because obviously of the welfare concerns there. But that's what popped into my mind because I'd never heard it. I haven't actually had it described to me in quite that way, and that like living in a truck or in a temporary stable, like that must not be a great life.
Well, it's a short period of their life. And,
Yeah.
God, horses are so adaptable, really. And that's why we can do what we do with them. But what I'm saying is, I think some horses cope well with these things and some horses clearly don't. And I just think we need to start to look at things from the horse's point of view, not being able to be in a stable. We know from the research that group stability is very important to them. Being able to control their environment is very important to them. Having some sort of being able to predict things is important to them. So being able to actually think about life from the horse's perspective is, I think, the way that we should all be thinking.
And can I just ask you, Nat, you mentioned there about how some things that are potentially unpleasant from the horse are probably part of the lives that we give them. How much compensation is needed? I know it's probably a question that's impossible to answer, but how much positivity can outweigh negative? Is it measured in duration? Is it measured in intensity? Is there any way your ordinary horse owner could say, well, I'll only go to 2 competitions this month because I'm doing better for my horse by doing that, and someone else might say, oh, I can go to 2 a week? Is there any way of coming up with a formula that puts the horse's interests first, given that we have them for the purposes that we have them?
I don't think that there is a formula. I think just as with people, all horses are individuals. And so for some horses, they cope better than others. And some appear to enjoy the interaction, with people more than others. And some, seem to enjoy the limelight. The people will talk about horses that have been at the top of their career and how it's difficult for them to adjust when, all of that buzz and interaction and excitement or stuff happening isn't there anymore. So yeah, every horse is individual, but I do think that if equestrians are horse centric first, if they are prioritizing their horses' well-being, that they do need to be able to act on what they can see, because I'm pretty sure that most people can see when a horse is not having a good time. I got sent a video recently of somebody who I know, and she was saying to me that they were very disappointed that this pony had not performed very well in its jumping when it was at a competition. And then she went on to say that there was a Ferris wheel there and that there was a lot of activity because it was a big show with lots going on. And if you actually watch the video, everything about that horse's behavior was telling you that it was frightened, that it didn't want to go down that end of the arena. It started to rear, which is an absolutely extreme anti-go response. And the rider did fall off outside in the collecting arena even before they went in. So, we all, they knew, it was clear from the horses' communication to them that it was a problem. And yet the pressure of the day, they'd gone a long way to the show, the horses, trying to qualify for something. It made them do something that afterwards, on reflection, was probably not in the best interest of that horse. And the horse was showing it. I'm pretty sure that girl who rode Saint Boy at the Olympics, the German lady, is probably, despite all of the awfulness that's happened since then, I'm sure for her on social media, I'm sure that even in her moments of reflection, she would have realised that what happened was not in the best interest of that horse. So that horse was clearly stressed and clearly didn't want to do what she was asking it to do. So I think listening to the horse, and if you don't know the behaviors that the horse expresses when it's, not having a good time, then learn them, because there are huge amounts of, there's a lot of information out there, and it's not just in science form. There's some great websites that give you, behavioral expression. And so I do think, things that people need to be taught at Pony Club and riding schools and so on are really about the fact that they're sitting on a horse. And this is how the horse communicates with you. And when the horse does this, it's not just being naughty, it's actually telling you that it's painful or it's frightened or it just doesn't want to do it. In fact, one of the things that resonated the most with me years ago was I listened to a lady called Bidder Jones. Karen, you'll know her. Well, she's in Australia, fantastic advocate for animals. But she gave a talk about horses. I didn't know that she knew anything about horses. And to be honest with you, it didn't matter if she did or she didn't, because what she said was, how many of you get on your horse and go ride it to the end of the drive? And if the horse wants to go right, you go right. And if the horse wants to go left, you go right. And if the horse doesn't want to go anywhere, you go home. How many do that for the horse? I thought, well, at the time I was thinking, well, you wouldn't, because you'd never get it fit. You'd never ride it. And that made me think, well, why am I thinking like that? If the horse doesn't enjoy it, then, and isn't kind of willingly making the choice to go somewhere, then, how do you feel about that? You really want the horse to be a willing participant.
Yeah. And I've been sitting here, Nat, thinking as you're saying that, you spoke about how animal welfare science has really matured. And I think one of the things to come out of that is this whole notion of agency for animals. And I guess that's really what you're talking about there, is the willing participant. Can you add anything more about that?
I could talk for a long time on this, but yes, I think that what's exciting has been the use of choice tests. So, you can do that kind of field observation approach, which is, I sit on my big horse here, and we don't do any fancy stuff anymore. He's getting a bit older. Occasionally, we might sort of raise to a baby piaffe just for fun, but generally speaking, we go in the arena. He doesn't want to be in there very long. We do it because I enjoy going around in circles still. But then when we go out, and he's very quick to want to go out, we go out walkabout, and he's the one who decides where we go on the property. So we go right, we go left, we go where he wants to go. And yes, he doesn't come home. He still wants to be out exploring. And now you could say that's training, or or just habit, but it is different depending on the different rides. So in my mind, I'm sort of giving him some agency, because I can. I'm not. It's not my living. It's not what I do for my sport or my, my livelihood. I think though that giving animals choices, so setting things up so that A, it's easy for them to learn, and B, they can make some choices, so they've got some control, is important. I think it's important for their mental well-being. And even something like we have stables here, and like a lot of people, if I have to bring my horses in, I want them to be able to touch each other and be next to each other. So we have walls between our horses, but the walls are only chest height or just above chest height, and they can interact fully over the walls when they're inside. And that gives them some control over their environment. But they also need to be able to get away from each other. Not all horses get on. So being able to provide them with some area that has a barrier there, so if they don't want to get involved, they can move away. That's simple stuff. And it's not difficult to do. And you see them using it and making choices, and you're providing them with agency. So, and if you just think about all the things, even the paddocks, the hay situation. So, how many people rush out and put 3 piles of hay on the floor and there's 3 horses? And then what happens when one finishes quick or, wants to push the others off? Agency is all about, well, put 4 piles out or 5 piles, put them around the place. And that way the horses have some control over their environment.
Yeah. Well, I love all of those suggestions, Nat. And one of the things we really love, don't we, Mita, is just that there are so many little things that people can do that can make a really big difference. We don't have to upend the apple cart and totally tear down everything about what people are doing, because by and large there are many good things that people do, but there are so many little things that we could change that would make such a big difference. So I love your idea of just 4 piles of hay.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think that's the problem though, is that for a long time, welfare science really started with the farming industry, and my PhD it was with the pig farming industry, and they would sort of see the welfare scientists come and want to run for the hills, like, oh, here they come. What do they want us to change now? And it always felt like change was a very negative, losing out thing. And we know that change can actually be about gain. And I think if you can demonstrate that it's not a difficult thing to provide for the needs of your horse, and that it doesn't mean a revolution. It just means that you are adapting some of the things that you do to take on board what we now know about horse needs, and enable horses to live a better life. It's all everybody. Anybody who loves their horse, they want to make sure that their horse is living a great life. And that they get a great death as well, that it's when it's time, and that the right choice is made on behalf of that horse.
Yeah, and I think we were quick to say, oh, horse people are very traditional, but actually horse people are actually quite ingenious too in coming up with solutions and problem solving. And I think that's what you're tapping into there, is the small little things that they can change in their own setup that could really make a difference. Nat, we have a Jeannie in this virtual studio, so she's a virtual Jeannie, but she gives you the opportunity to get one wish granted. Anything in the horse world that you would love to see happen, you'd love to see change, some innovation. What would be the wish that you would ask that Jeannie to grant?
Oh, goodness me. What would be my wish? I think my wish would probably be for people to be open to the possibility, to be curious about what we're learning all the time about these amazing creatures. For me, our research now has moved much more into trying to look at positive emotions in horses. We weren't even allowed to talk about emotions when I first started. And there are people who still talk about affective states, but I think we're talking about emotions. Let's just say it as it is. There might not be the same emotions as me, but I do actually believe that the reason that I like being around my horses is because I feel, and I think that they feel too. And so what I want them to feel when I'm in their lives is good. So be open. And I think if you are curious and you are open and you're willing to adapt, then, well, as Karen says, we'll have happy horses and happy people.
Oh, what a fabulous way to end that. Thank you so much. I could keep talking for at least another couple of hours, but I know that we all have busy lives that we need to get on with. But thank you so much. We've really enjoyed having you on the show today.
Grand. Well, thank you very
Yes.
much, Dave, for inviting me.
Yes, thanks,
Yeah.
Nat. It's been absolutely, absolutely wonderful, and loads of practical take-home messages for our listeners, which is what we always like to provide. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Wasn't that just great? We hope you enjoyed it as much as Karen and I did. And if you'd like to hear more great content, our back episodes are all available on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and all good podcast platforms. Please like, share, subscribe, and tell your friends. We really want to build a Changing Rein community, and we need your help. If you want to get in touch, our email is team@changingrein.com.au. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you.